Commander Zexhai walked through the human outpost with his head held high. His forearms swung freely at his sides as he stepped over broken pieces of metal and glass. The battle was over, and his forces had won easily. Too easily, he thought for a moment, but then pushed the doubt away. These humans were weak creatures who relied on old weapons and poor tactics. The outpost smelled of smoke and burned electronics. Emergency lights flickered on the walls, casting strange shadows that danced across the floor. Zexhai's boots made loud clicking sounds on the metal flooring as he moved from room to room. His soldiers had already secured the area and gathered all the human prisoners in the main corridor. 23 humans sat against the wall, with their hands tied behind their backs. Most of them looked young and scared. Their eyes darted around, nervously as Valtharan soldiers stood guard over them. Some of the prisoners had small cuts on their faces from the fighting. Others had torn uniforms that showed how quickly they had surrendered. Zexhai studied each prisoner carefully. These were supposed to be the dangerous humans that had been causing trouble in this sector of space. They looked pathetic. Their skin was soft and pink, nothing like the thick gray hide of his own people. They were smaller too, most of them barely reaching his chest even when standing. How could creatures like these pose any real threat to the mighty Valtharan Empire? The commander stopped in front of a pile of human weapons that his soldiers had collected. Rifles, pistols, and various pieces of equipment lay scattered in a messy heap. He picked up one of the rifles and turned it over in his large hands. The weapon felt heavy and crude compared to the sleek plasma rifles his own troops carried. "Primitive," he said out loud, speaking in his native language so the humans could not understand. "These kinetic projectile weapons are at least 50 years behind our technology. No wonder they fell so quickly." His Lieutenant Corthan approached from the other side of the room. The younger officer carried a datapad that showed the casualty reports from the battle. "Commander, we lost only 2 soldiers in the entire assault. The humans managed to destroy one of our transport vehicles, but that appears to have been lucky shot with some kind of explosive device." Zexhai nodded approvingly. "And their losses?" 47 confirmed dead, 23 captured alive. The rest either escaped into the surrounding forest or were vaporized during the plasma bombardment phase. Corthan paused to check his datapad again. "Our intelligence was correct. These humans fight like animals, but they lack any real military discipline or advanced weaponry." The commander felt satisfied with these numbers. His superiors would be pleased with such an efficient victory. This outpost had been identified as a major human stronghold in the region, and taking it would open up several new routes for the invasion fleet. Soon the entire planet would belong to the Valtharan Empire. As he continued his inspection, Zexhai noticed something that made him pause. One of the rifles lying near the weapons pile was different from the others. It was longer and had a more complex design. A large scope was mounted on top of the barrel, and the entire weapon looked like it had been carefully maintained. Strange markings covered the stock and barrel, but he could not read human writing. More interesting was the human sitting closest to this particular rifle. Unlike the other prisoners, this one did not look scared or defeated. He was older than most of the others, with gray hair and deep lines around his eyes. His uniform was different too, with various patches and badges that Zexhai had not seen on the other soldiers. The man sat perfectly straight against the wall, his back not even touching the surface behind him. His eyes moved constantly, taking in everything around him. When those eyes met Zexhai's, the human did not look away or show fear. Instead, he simply watched and waited like a predator studying its surroundings. This behavior was unusual. Most humans either cowered in fear when faced with Valtharan soldiers or tried to show defiance through angry words and gestures. This one did neither. He was completely calm, almost as if being captured was part of some larger plan. Zexhai found himself walking closer to examine this strange prisoner. The human's uniform bore several small metal badges pinned to the chest area. Most of them meant nothing to the alien commander, but one caught his attention. It was a circular piece of metal with numbers etched into its surface. The craftsmanship was surprisingly good for such a primitive species. The badge showed the number 3200. Below that were smaller markings that looked like measurements of some kind. Zexhai had studied human numbering systems during his preparation for the invasion, so he could read the basic numerals. But what did 3200 represent? Was it a unit number? A date according to their calendar system? Some kind of identification code? You, Zexai said, pointing at the gray-haired human. He spoke in the basic trade language that most species in the galaxy could understand. What is your name and rank? The human looked up at him with steady eyes. Staff Sergeant Marcus Chen, 3rd Battalion Reconnaissance. He replied in the same trade language. His accent was thick, but understandable. And this badge, Zexai continued, pointing at the metal circle on Chen's uniform. What does the number mean? Chen glanced down at his chest, then back up at the towering alien. That's the distance, Commander, he said simply. Distance of what? Corthan interjected, stepping closer to hear the conversation better. The distance of my longest confirmed kill. 3,200 meters. Chen's voice remained calm and matter-of-fact, as if he were discussing something as ordinary as the weather. The silence that followed was heavy and uncomfortable. Zexai felt something cold move through his chest. In the Viltharan military, their best marksmen could accurately hit targets at maybe 800 meters using advanced plasma weapons with computer targeting assistance. The idea of hitting anything at 3,200 meters with a primitive kinetic weapon seemed impossible. But as he looked at the strange rifle lying nearby and then back at the unshakable calm in Chen's eyes, Zexai began to wonder if his easy victory might not be as complete as he had thought. Zexai stared at the human for a long moment. The number 3,200 kept echoing in his mind. He had heard Chen correctly, but the meaning seemed impossible to accept. No living creature could accurately shoot a weapon at that distance. The physics alone made it nearly impossible, even with the most advanced technology. Corthan moved closer to his commander, sensing the tension in the air. The younger officer had been studying human military capabilities for months in preparation for the invasion. He knew their weapon specifications better than most Viltharan soldiers. What this human was claiming went far beyond anything in their intelligence reports. You are lying, Corthan said firmly, his 3 eyes focusing on Chen's face to watch for signs of deception. Our research shows that human kinetic weapons lose accuracy beyond 500 meters. Even your best military snipers cannot engage targets effectively past 1,000 meters. What you claim is physically impossible. Chen turned his head slightly to look at the lieutenant. His expression did not change at all. There was no anger at being called a liar, no frustration at not being believed. He simply observed the alien officer with the same calm attention he had been showing since his capture. Your research is based on standard military weapons and average soldiers, Chen replied evenly. This rifle was custom-built for extreme long-range work. The barrel was handcrafted by a master gunsmith. The scope was calibrated specifically for my shooting style and physical characteristics. The ammunition was hand-loaded with precise powder charges and carefully selected bullets. Zexai found himself looking more closely at the weapon lying near Chen. Now that he examined it more carefully, he could see that it was indeed different from the other human rifles. The barrel was longer and thicker. The stock had been modified with additional padding and adjustments. The scope mounted on top was massive compared to the simple sights on other human weapons. Even if your weapon is superior, Zexai said, slowly, the calculation required for such a shot would be enormous. Wind speed, air temperature, humidity, target movement, bullet trajectory drop. No organic mind could process all those variables accurately enough to make such a shot. Chen smiled for the first time since the conversation began. It was not a pleasant expression. There was something predatory about it that made both alien officers feel uncomfortable. Commander, how long have your people been using energy weapons? Chen asked. The question seemed strange, but Zexai answered anyway. Energy weapons have been standard in our military for over 300 years. Plasma rifles, laser cannons, particle beam weapons, all computer-controlled for maximum accuracy. And before that, we used kinetic projectile weapons similar to yours, but that was centuries ago. Primitive technology that we abandoned as soon as better options became available. Chen nodded as if this answer explained everything. That's your problem, Commander. You forgot how to hunt. When you rely on computers to do all your thinking, You lose the skills that organic minds can develop. My people have been using projectile weapons for thousands of years. We never stopped learning how to use them better. Corthan made a dismissive gesture with one of his arms. Impossible. Computer calculations are always more accurate than organic estimation. Mathematics does not make mistakes. You're right about the mathematics, Chen agreed. But you're wrong about organic minds being unable to handle complex calculations. A human brain can process thousands of variables simultaneously and make adjustments based on experience and intuition that no computer program has ever been able to match. The human shifted his position slightly, moving his bound hands to a more comfortable position. The movement was smooth and controlled, showing no signs of the stress that most prisoners would be feeling. Let me give you an example, Chen continued. 3 days ago, one of your scout ships was conducting reconnaissance flights over this area. Small vessel, maybe 3 crew members, flying in a standard search pattern at approximately 2,000 meters altitude. The pilot was following the same route he had used for the previous 2 days, probably thinking he was being unpredictable. Zexai felt his breathing become more shallow. He remembered that scout ship. It had been part of the advanced reconnaissance mission, gathering intelligence about human defensive positions before the main assault. The ship had simply stopped responding to communications and crashed in the forest. They had assumed it was a technical malfunction. Your pilot made several mistakes, Chen said, his voice taking on the tone of someone giving a lecture. First, he followed a predictable pattern. Same altitude, same speed, same general flight path. Second, he underestimated human sensor capabilities. That scope has thermal imaging built in. Your ship's engines run hot and show up clearly against the cold sky. Third, he stayed in one position too long while conducting his survey. The human gestured toward his rifle with a small nod of his head. I had been tracking your ship for 2 days, learning its patterns. On the 3rd day, I positioned myself on a ridge approximately 3,200 meters from where I calculated the ship would pause to conduct its detailed scan of this outpost. I waited for 4 hours until the ship arrived exactly where I expected it to be. Corthan was checking his datapad frantically now, pulling up reports from the reconnaissance mission. His hands were shaking slightly as he read through the incident reports. The shot went through the cockpit window, Chen continued calmly. Clean hit on the pilot. The ship lost control immediately and crashed into the forest about 2 kilometers. From here, you probably found the wreckage eventually, but I doubt you understood what really happened. This is impossible, Corthan whispered, but his voice lacked conviction now. The data on his pad was confirming what Chen had described. The scout ship had indeed crashed at the time and location the human was describing. Zexai activated his communication device with trembling hands. Command, I need a complete report on the scout ship that crashed in Grid Sector 7 Alpha 3 days ago. I want to know the exact cause of the crash and the condition of the crew. While they waited for the response, Chen continued talking. Your people have superior technology, Commander, but you have forgotten the most important skill in warfare. Patience. I spent 6 months learning your patrol patterns, studying your ship designs, understanding your tactics. Every day I watched and learned, preparing for the moment when you would finally come. The communication device crackled to life. Commander, the scout ship crash was caused by catastrophic damage to the cockpit area. The pilot was killed by what appears to be a high-velocity projectile that penetrated the transperistyle window. The other 2 crew members died in the crash. We assumed it was some kind of equipment malfunction or possibly a meteorite strike. Zexai felt the ground seem to shift beneath his feet. Everything he thought he knew about human capabilities was wrong. These were not primitive creatures with obsolete weapons. They were predators who had spent generations perfecting the art of killing from impossible distances. Chen was watching both alien officers carefully, reading their expressions and body language with practiced eyes. Now you're beginning to understand. Commander, this war you think you're winning has barely begun. The silence in the outpost was broken only by the quiet humming of damaged electrical systems and the nervous breathing of the other human prisoners. Zexai stood frozen, staring at Chen while his mind tried to process what he had just heard. One human soldier with a primitive weapon had destroyed a Veltheran scout ship from over 3 kilometers away. It seemed impossible, yet the evidence was right there in their own military reports. Corthan was scrolling through more data on his pad, his movements becoming increasingly frantic. His 3 eyes darted back and forth across the screen as he pulled up file after file. Sweat was beginning to form on his gray forehead despite the cool temperature in the outpost. "Commander," Corthan said, his voice barely above a whisper, "I am finding more incidents. Several more scout ships have gone missing in this sector over the past 6 months. All of them were attributed to technical failures or navigation errors." Chen shifted his weight against the wall, making himself more comfortable. He was watching the 2 alien officers with the same calm attention a scientist might show while observing an interesting experiment. There was no satisfaction in his expression, no pride or boasting. He was simply stating facts and waiting for them to understand the implications. "How many ships?" Zexhai asked, though he was not sure he wanted to know the answer. Corthan continued, reading from his datapad. 7 confirmed losses in the past 6 months. All single-ship reconnaissance missions, all lost without sending distress signals. The wreckage from 3 of them was recovered, but the damage was attributed to impact with the ground after catastrophic system failures. "Check the distances," Chen said quietly. "Check how far each crash site was from this outpost." The lieutenant began entering coordinates into his mapping system. As each location appeared on the screen, a pattern began to emerge. The crash sites formed a rough circle around the human base, with the closest being about 2,800 meters away, and the farthest nearly 4,000 meters distant. Zexhai felt something cold spreading through his chest. "You killed them all." "Every single one," Chen confirmed without any emotion in his voice. "Your pilots made the same mistakes over and over again. Predictable flight patterns, overconfidence in their technology, lack of awareness about ground-based threats. After the first 2 ships, I started keeping a detailed log of your reconnaissance operations." The human nodded toward a small notebook that had fallen from one of the alien soldiers during the fighting. It lay on the floor about 10 feet away, its pages scattered by the battle. 6 months of observations, flight times, altitudes, crew behavior patterns, ship vulnerabilities. Everything I needed to know to hunt your people effectively. Corthan was shaking now, his hands barely able to hold the datapad steady. But the distances involved, the calculations required for each shot, the environmental factors, even if you could make one such shot, doing it repeatedly would be impossible. Chen smiled again, and this time both aliens took an unconscious step backward. There was something deeply unsettling about that expression, like looking into the eyes of a natural predator that had been pretending to be harmless. "Lieutenant, your people have been using energy weapons for so long that you have forgotten what projectile ballistics actually involve. Every shot teaches you something new. Every miss shows you exactly what you did wrong. After 40 years of shooting, calculating trajectory becomes as natural as walking." The human began explaining in the same calm, educational tone he had been using throughout the conversation. "The first ship took me 3 shots to bring down. I had to adjust for wind conditions that I had not properly accounted for. The second ship only took 2 shots because I had learned more about your transparasteel windows and how they react to high-velocity impacts. By the 4th ship, I was making first shot kills consistently." Zexhai found himself looking more closely at the other human prisoners. Most of them were still showing signs of fear and stress, but a few were watching the conversation with expressions similar to Chen's calm attention. How many of them were also trained killers? How many of them had skills that Valtheran intelligence had completely missed? "Show me," Zexhai said suddenly. The words came out before he had fully thought them through. "Sir," Corthan protested. "Immediately." "Show me how you make such a shot," the commander continued, his voice growing stronger. "If you can really do what you claim, prove it. There is a communication relay tower on the hill to the north of this outpost. It is approximately 2,500 meters away." Chen looked thoughtful for a moment, as if considering the request seriously. "You want me to destroy your own equipment to prove my capabilities?" "Yes. And you will untie my hands and allow me to handle my rifle." Zexhai hesitated. Giving a weapon to a captured enemy soldier went against every military protocol he had ever learned. But his need to understand the truth was stronger than his caution. If this human really could make impossible shots, he needed to see it with his own eyes. Your hands will be untied, but you will be surrounded by armed guards. Any attempt to turn the weapon on my soldiers will result in your immediate death. Understood, Commander. The next few minutes were tense as Valtharan soldiers positioned themselves around Chen while Korthan carefully cut the restraints binding the human's wrists. Chen flexed his fingers slowly, working feeling back into his hands after hours of being tied up. He approached his rifle with the careful reverence that a priest might show when handling a sacred artifact. His hands moved over the weapon with practiced familiarity, checking various components and adjustments. He worked the bolt action several times to ensure smooth operation, then examined the scope settings. This scope was zeroed for the exact distance to that communication tower, Chen said as he made minor adjustments to the magnification. I have been planning to eliminate that relay as part of our defensive strategy for weeks. He settled into a shooting position, lying flat on the floor with the rifle supported by a makeshift rest created from some debris. The position looked uncomfortable to the aliens watching, but Chen seemed completely at ease. Through the damaged window of the outpost, the communication tower was barely visible as a tiny dark shape against the sky. Even with enhanced alien vision, Zexhai could barely make out any details of the structure. Chen spent several minutes making final adjustments to his position and scope settings. He was completely focused now, his breathing slow and controlled. The aliens watched in fascination as he seemed to enter some kind of trance-like state. Wind is calm, temperature stable, target stationary, Chen murmured to himself. Range 2489 meters, elevation angle 6 degrees. The shot, when it came, was surprisingly quiet. The rifle made a sharp crack that echoed through the outpost, but it was much less dramatic than the plasma weapons the aliens were used to. For several seconds, nothing seemed to happen. Then, in the distance, they saw a flash of light as the communication tower exploded in a shower of sparks and debris. Chen worked the bolt of his rifle and carefully set the weapon down. Your turn, Commander. Show me what your best marksman can do at that distance. The explosion of the communication tower echoed across the landscape like thunder. Pieces of metal and electronic equipment rained down from the hilltop where the relay had stood moments before. Zexhai watched the debris fall and felt something fundamental shift in his understanding of warfare. Chen's challenge hung in the air between them. Show me what your best marksman can do at that distance. The human had spoken the words quietly, but they carried the weight of absolute confidence. He knew that no Valtharan soldier could match what he had just accomplished. Korthan was staring at the distant explosion site through a pair of electronic binoculars. His hands shook as he adjusted the magnification to get a better view of the damage. Direct hit on the primary power coupling, he reported in a voice barely above a whisper. The entire relay system has been completely destroyed. How is this possible? Zexhai asked, though he was no longer questioning whether Chen could make such shots. He had seen the proof with his own eyes. Now he needed to understand how a primitive species could develop capabilities that his own advanced civilization had never achieved. Chen settled back against the wall, his rifle carefully placed beside him. He looked completely relaxed, as if destroying military targets from impossible distances was just another ordinary task. The other human prisoners were watching him with expressions that mixed admiration and satisfaction. Commander, your people made a fundamental mistake when you developed energy weapons, Chen began, his voice taking on the tone of a teacher explaining a complex subject to students. You assumed that technology would always be superior to biological capability. You stopped training your soldiers to think and started training them to rely on computers. The human gestured toward the plasma rifles that the Valtharan soldiers carried. Those weapons are impressive. They can fire accurately at medium ranges with minimal training required. Point, shoot, and let the targeting computer do all the work. Very efficient for mass production armies. Zexhai found himself nodding despite his growing unease. What Chen was describing was exactly how Valtharan military doctrine worked. Standardized equipment, computer-assisted targeting. minimal individual training requirements. It allowed them to equip large numbers of soldiers quickly and efficiently. But efficiency is not the same as effectiveness, Chen continued. When you rely entirely on technology, you become helpless when that technology fails or encounters situations it was not designed to handle. Your soldiers have forgotten how to adapt, how to improvise, how to think for themselves. Corthan lowered his binoculars and turned to face the human. Our weapons are more advanced than anything your species has ever created. Computer-assisted targeting is more accurate than organic estimation. The mathematics prove this. Chen smiled patiently. Lieutenant, you are thinking like an engineer instead of thinking like a warrior. Mathematics can tell you where a bullet should go under perfect conditions. But war never provides perfect conditions. Real combat involves constantly changing variables that no computer program can predict. The human held up one hand and began counting off on his fingers. Wind conditions that shift every few seconds, temperature changes that affect air density, target movement patterns that follow no predictable algorithm, equipment malfunctions that require instant adaptation, stress and fatigue that affect physical performance. He paused to let his words sink in before continuing. A computer can calculate the theoretical perfect shot, but it cannot adapt when reality does not match the theory. An experienced human shooter learns to read all those variables instinctively and make adjustments that no programming could ever anticipate. Zexhai was beginning to understand, but the implications terrified him. You are saying that biological intelligence can exceed artificial intelligence in certain applications, not just exceed it, Commander, completely dominate it under the right circumstances. Chen's expression grew more serious. My people have been hunting and fighting for thousands of years. We have never stopped developing our natural abilities even as our technology advanced. We kept both skills because we understood that technology alone is never enough. The human looked around the outpost, taking in the damage from the battle and the positions of the alien soldiers. Your invasion plan was based on technological superiority. You assumed that advanced weapons would guarantee victory against a primitive enemy. But you never considered that primitiveness might actually be an advantage in some situations. Corthan was consulting his datapad again, apparently trying to find some piece of information that would contradict what Chen was telling them. Our intelligence reports indicate that human military forces rely heavily on their own advanced technology. Aircraft, armored vehicles, guided missiles, satellite communications. You are absolutely right, Chen agreed. Our regular military does rely on advanced technology, and your forces have been very effective against them in conventional engagements. But Earth has another kind of soldier that your intelligence never identified. The human gestured toward his rifle, and then toward several of the other prisoners who were still watching the conversation intently. Hunters, outdoorsmen, sport, shooters, military veterans who learned their skills decades ago and never stopped practicing. People who grew up learning to track animals through forests, to read weather patterns, to make difficult shots under challenging conditions. Zexhai felt his confidence continuing to erode as he began to grasp the full scope of what Chen was describing. How many such individuals exist on your planet? Millions, Commander. Your invasion fleet is not just fighting the human military. You are fighting an entire planet full of people who consider hunting and shooting to be recreational activities. Every rural area, every small town, every farming community has dozens of people with skills similar to mine. The alien commander tried to process this information. His invasion plan had been based on defeating organized military resistance and then controlling the civilian population through superior firepower. The idea that civilians could pose a serious threat to his forces had never been considered. Even if what you say is true, Corthan said desperately, individual marksmen cannot defeat an entire invasion fleet. You lack the heavy weapons, the air support, the coordinated tactics necessary for large-scale warfare. Chen's smile returned, and this time it was genuinely frightening. Lieutenant, you are still thinking like a conventional military officer. You assume that we need to defeat your entire fleet in open battle. But that is not how hunters fight. The human leaned forward slightly, his voice dropping to almost a whisper. We do not need to destroy your ships or defeat your main forces. We just need to make it impossible for you to accomplish your mission. Every scout you send out, every patrol you deploy, Every supply convoy you run will face the possibility of sudden death from an invisible enemy at impossible range. He gestured toward the destroyed communication tower. Your technology requires communication networks, supply lines, reconnaissance operations. All of those depend on predictable movement patterns and fixed installations. Perfect targets for people who specialize in patient-precise elimination of critical assets. The implications were staggering. Zexai realized that his invasion force could find itself completely blind and isolated, unable to coordinate operations or maintain contact with their fleet. Even with superior technology, an army that could not communicate or resupply would eventually be defeated. You cannot be everywhere at once, Zexai said, though his voice lacked conviction. Chen looked directly into the alien commander's eyes. Commander, I am just one man with one rifle. But there are thousands of others like me across this planet, and right now they are all moving into position. As if summoned by Chen's words, Zexai's communication device began crackling with urgent transmissions. The first message came from the eastern sector, where another company of Valtharan troops had been advancing toward a human settlement. Command, this is Captain Vorthek. We have lost contact with our forward reconnaissance team. Last transmission indicated they were investigating unusual activity near grid reference 4-7 Alpha. The voice was tense and professional, but Zexai could hear underlying worry. Corthan immediately began checking tactical displays on his portable unit. Sir, that reconnaissance team was equipped with our most advanced sensor equipment. They should have been able to detect any human forces within a 5-kilometer radius. Chen watched the alien officers with the same calm attention he had been showing throughout their conversation. Your sensors are designed to detect large groups of soldiers, vehicles, and electronic signatures. A single human with a rifle produces almost no detectable emissions. Another transmission crackled through the communication device. Command, this is Lieutenant Zalthor reporting from the Northern Advance. Our lead scout vehicle has been destroyed by unknown weapons fire. No enemy forces visible in the area, requesting immediate air support for reconnaissance. Zexai felt his stomach tighten as more reports began flooding in. Similar incidents were occurring across multiple sectors of the invasion front. Scout teams going silent, vehicles being destroyed by invisible attackers, communication relays failing without explanation. How is this possible? Corthan whispered as he monitored the incoming reports. These attacks are happening simultaneously across hundreds of kilometers. No human force could coordinate such widespread operations without detectable communications. Chen shifted his position against the wall, making himself more comfortable. Lieutenant, you are still thinking in terms of centralized command and control. This is not a coordinated military operation. This is something much more dangerous. Human paused to let his words sink in before continuing. What you are experiencing is called emergent behavior. Thousands of individual hunters acting independently but toward the same general goal. No communication required, no central command structure, no detectable organization. He gestured toward the communication device that was still receiving urgent reports. Every one of those attacks is being carried out by people like me. Farmers who learned to shoot hunting deer, police officers trained in urban combat, military veterans who never forgot their skills, ordinary citizens who decided they do not appreciate uninvited guests. The scope of what Chen was describing was beginning to become clear to Zexai. This was not a conventional military resistance. This was an entire population turning into a distributed network of individual predators, each one capable of striking without warning and then disappearing. But without coordination, without supplies, without organized support, individual fighters cannot sustain long-term operations, Corthan protested, though his voice was becoming less confident with each passing minute. You are assuming we need the same kind of support structure that your military requires, Chen replied patiently. A human sniper needs very little to remain effective for extended periods. A rifle, a few hundred rounds of ammunition, basic survival equipment, and knowledge of the local terrain. The human nodded toward the forest visible through the damaged windows of the outpost. This planet is our home, Commander. We know every hill, every valley, every hiding place. We can move through terrain that your soldiers would find impossible to navigate. We can find food and shelter in areas where your forces would starve." Another urgent transmission interrupted their conversation. "Command, this is Major Kethvar commanding the Western advance. We have lost 3 more scout ships in the past hour, all destroyed by what appears to be ground-based weapons fire at extreme range. Our pilots are requesting permission to increase altitude to avoid further losses." Zexhai responded immediately. "Permission granted. All reconnaissance flights are to maintain minimum altitude of 5,000 meters." Chen smiled knowingly. "That will not help them, Commander. There are humans on this planet who can make accurate shots at aircraft flying much higher than 5,000 meters, and once your pilots start flying higher, they become even more predictable in their flight patterns." The alien commander was beginning to feel trapped in a situation that his training had never prepared him for. Every tactical decision seemed to lead to new vulnerabilities. Every attempt to adapt to human capabilities revealed additional threats that had not been anticipated. "What do you want?" Zexhai asked finally, his pride crumbling in the face of tactical reality. "Right now, I want you to understand the nature of the war you have started," Chen replied seriously. "This is not a conflict between armies or governments. This is not about territory or resources. You have invaded a planet full of apex predators who consider hunting to be a fundamental part of their identity." The human looked around at the other prisoners, many of whom were nodding in agreement. "Every small town has its local hunting guides. Every rural community has competitive marksmen. Every military base has trained snipers. You have not just invaded a world, Commander. You have entered the largest hunting preserve in the galaxy." As if to emphasize his point, the distant sound of rifle fire began echoing across the landscape. Single shots, spaced apart by several seconds, each one precise and deliberate. The sound was coming from multiple directions, creating a deadly symphony that spoke of coordinated individual actions rather than organized military engagement. Corthan was monitoring multiple communication channels now, trying to keep track of the growing number of incidents across the invasion front. "Sir, we are receiving reports of sniper activity from 17 different sectors. Our losses are mounting exponentially." "And this is just the beginning," Chen said quietly. "Right now, the hunters are still moving into position. They are learning your patterns, studying your equipment, understanding your weaknesses. Within a few days, your entire invasion force will be operating under constant threat from invisible enemies." The human's expression grew more serious as he continued. "Your soldiers will not be able to move safely during daylight hours. Your supply convoys will face constant attack. Your communication networks will be systematically destroyed. Your reconnaissance operations will become impossible." Zexhai realized that his entire invasion strategy was becoming untenable. An army that could not move, communicate, or gather intelligence would eventually be defeated regardless of its technological advantages. "You speak as if this outcome is inevitable," the commander said, though he was beginning to believe it himself. Chen met his gaze steadily. "Commander, your people made one critical error in planning this invasion. You assumed that advanced technology would guarantee victory against a primitive enemy. But you never considered that sometimes the most primitive predator is also the most dangerous." The sound of distant gunfire continued to echo across the landscape, each shot a reminder that somewhere a Valtheran soldier was learning too late about human capabilities. Zexhai stood in the damaged outpost, surrounded by his supposedly defeated enemies, and began to understand that his invasion had become a hunting expedition where his forces were the prey. The reports coming through Zexhai's communication device were becoming increasingly desperate. What had started as isolated incidents was now clearly a coordinated campaign of systematic destruction, targeting every aspect of the Valtheran invasion force. The aliens were discovering that their technological superiority meant nothing when they could not see their enemies or predict where the next attack would come from. "Command, this is Colonel Vexthol commanding the main advance column," came a transmission filled with static and background noise. "We have lost 60% of our reconnaissance assets in the past 6 hours. Our supply convoy was attacked 20 minutes ago. No survivors. We are requesting immediate withdrawal to defensive positions." Corthan looked up from his datapad with an expression of complete bewilderment. "Sir, We are receiving similar requests from commanders across the entire front. Our forces are being systematically dismantled by enemies we cannot locate or engage effectively. Chen had been listening to the reports with obvious satisfaction. The calm confidence he had shown throughout the conversation was now accompanied by something that looked almost like professional pride. Colonel Vexthol is a smart officer, he commented. Requesting withdrawal shows good tactical sense under the circumstances. You seem pleased that your people are killing mine, Zexhai observed, his voice carrying a mixture of anger and grudging respect. Commander, I am pleased that my people are defending their home effectively, Chen corrected. This is not about killing for pleasure. This is about survival against an invading force that came here to conquer and subjugate. The human shifted his position against the wall, wincing slightly as movement reminded him of injuries sustained during the initial battle. Your intelligence reports probably told you that humans are an emotional species driven by irrational impulses, that we would panic when faced with superior technology and surrender quickly to avoid casualties. Zexhai nodded reluctantly. That assessment had indeed been part of their invasion planning. Human psychological profiles suggested they were prone to fear and would collapse rapidly when faced with overwhelming force. Your psychologists made the same mistake that your military strategists made, Chen continued. They studied human behavior in normal circumstances and assumed it would remain consistent under extreme threat. But they failed to understand what happens when you threaten something that humans consider sacred. The sound of distant explosions began to punctuate the rifle fire that had been echoing across the landscape. Apparently, the human resistance was escalating from sniper attacks to more aggressive sabotage operations. This planet is our home, Commander. Not just our territory or our resources, but our actual home. The place where our children grow up, where our families live, where our ancestors are buried. When you threaten that, you do not get frightened civilians. You get something much more dangerous. Chen looked directly at Zexhai, with an intensity that made the alien commander uncomfortable. You get an entire species that will fight with every skill they have ever learned, every weapon they can improvise, every advantage they can create. Not because they are ordered to, but because the alternative is unacceptable. Another transmission crackled through the communication device. Emergency alert to all units. The main fuel depot at Landing Zone Charlie has been destroyed by explosive devices. Cause unknown. No enemy forces detected in the area. All aircraft are grounded until further notice. Corthan was frantically trying to coordinate responses to the growing crisis, but it was becoming clear that the situation was spiraling beyond control. Sir, without fuel supplies and reconnaissance capability, our forces cannot maintain offensive operations. We need to consolidate at defensive positions immediately. That will not save you, Chen said matter-of-factly. Defensive positions just make you easier targets for long-range weapons. Every bunker, every fortification, every supply depot becomes a fixed target that we can study and attack at our convenience. The human gestured toward his rifle. Remember, Commander, I have been watching your people for 6 months. I know how you build defensive positions, how you position your guards, how you rotate your patrols. That knowledge is being shared with hundreds of other hunters who are already moving into position around your installations. Zexhai felt the full weight of his situation settling over him like a heavy blanket. His invasion force was trapped in hostile territory, unable to advance or retreat effectively, facing an enemy that could strike without warning from impossible distances. What would it take to end this? He asked quietly. Chen considered the question seriously before answering. Complete withdrawal of all Veltharan forces from Earth and the surrounding star system. No occupation, no territorial claims, no future invasion attempts. Just leave and do not come back. And if we refuse, the human's expression hardened, then you will learn what it means to fight a species that has spent its entire evolutionary history as persistence hunters. We do not give up, Commander. We do not surrender. We do not negotiate when our survival is at stake. We just keep hunting until the threat is eliminated. As if to emphasize his point, a new series of explosions echoed from the direction of the main Veltharan landing zone. Apparently, the human resistance had identified and targeted the primary supply facilities that the invasion force needed to maintain operations. Your people are trapped on a planet where every hill might hide a sniper. Every forest might conceal a sabotage team. Every civilian might be gathering intelligence for future attacks. Chen continued relentlessly. How long? Do you think your soldiers can maintain morale under those conditions? The communication device erupted with multiple simultaneous transmissions as unit commanders across the invasion front reported new attacks, equipment failures, and mounting casualties. The organized military operation that had begun so confidently was degenerating into a desperate struggle for survival. "We have orbital support," Zexhai said, though his voice lacked conviction. "Ship-based weapons that your ground forces cannot reach." Chen smiled grimly. "Commander, orbital bombardment requires target identification. How do you target an enemy you cannot locate? And if you start dropping heavy weapons on populated areas, you will discover what happens when you turn an entire civilian population into active resistance fighters." The human leaned forward slightly, his voice taking on a tone of absolute certainty. "Your ships can destroy our cities, but they cannot control our territory. Your soldiers can win individual battles, but they cannot win a war against an enemy that refuses to be defeated." Outside the outpost, the sounds of conflict were growing closer and more intense. Apparently, the human forces were beginning to consolidate their scattered attacks into more coordinated operations. "Your invasion is failing, Commander," Chen said with quiet finality. "Not because your technology is inadequate or your soldiers are poorly trained, but because you fundamentally misunderstood the nature of your enemy." Zexhai looked around the damaged outpost at the human prisoners, who were no longer acting like prisoners. They were watching him with the same calm confidence that Chen had shown throughout the conversation. These were not defeated enemies waiting for rescue. These were predators who had been temporarily inconvenienced. "You walked past my rifle and saw my badge," Chen continued, his voice carrying the weight of absolute truth. "You should have kept walking, Commander. You should have taken your forces and left this planet immediately. Because now you know what you are really fighting." The alien commander activated his communication device one final time. "All units, this is command. Implement emergency withdrawal protocols. Fall back to primary landing zones and prepare for immediate evacuation." Chen nodded approvingly. "Smart decision, Commander. But do not make the mistake of thinking this is over. Earth will remember this invasion attempt. And if your people ever decide to come back, they will find us much better prepared." As Vaeltheran forces across the planet began their desperate retreat, the sound of human weapons continued to echo across the landscape. Each shot was a reminder that sometimes the most dangerous enemy is the one who looks most primitive. Zexhai stood in the ruins of his easy victory, surrounded by enemies who had never really been defeated, and finally understood the meaning of the phrase that would haunt Vaeltheran military doctrine for generations to come. "Welcome to Earth."